So what if you got poly B? What's the solution? I mean,
I have a few places that have poly B, and I've never had an issue with them. It's nice to see the copper crimps, the specific crimps that are supposed to go with it as well, but not plastic crimps. The plastic crimps are tough ones. Those are the ones you want to be a bit leery about.
All right. Down the road, you buy a house with the understanding that it's got the poly B piping.
Yes, sir.
To replace that means often you're going to have to cutting into walls.
Yes, sir.
And
it's
that's
expensive.
where the expense comes.
Correct.
So you don't really want to do that. You just want to be aware that there's a possible issue.
Correct. And also, like I said before, there's sometimes insurance policies out there for that. Just like cast iron sewage going all the way out to the street. There are certain policies that I have on some of my rentals that I'll purchase just in case of a collapsation of the sewer. And they'll pay somewhere up to like $10,000 sometimes, but it depends on the insurance company that you're going with. And that's a lot better than paying like $27,000 in one lump sum.
All right.
Okay.
Let's go from poly B, from your general plumbing piping, because a lot of older homes, they've still got copper, and nothing wrong with copper. What other plumbing issues do you find in a house when you're doing a home inspection?
We see leaky P-traps, we see loose baskets at kitchen sinks and at laundry sinks. We see a lot of loose toilets, believe it or not. And typically when they're really loose, you want to take the toilet off and put on a new wax seal. The wax seal is not very expensive, but it's just for good, safe measure, and that's why we make the recommendation. So we don't have a big leak mark on our ceiling in the kitchen from a loose toilet. It's very easy to fix, like I said. Right. The other is back to cast iron. Like, that's something else that you should be looking at. In these older homes, sometimes in the 70s, but before the 70s, typically we see clay and cast iron. And usually you want to get those scoped because they can dilate just like poly B. They can get calcification, there can be offset joints, there can be anything under the sun.
When you say scoping, that's running the camera through.
That's correct, all the way out to the curb, so you can make sure that you got a good clean drain away all the way to the city. And if you don't have that, you have the risk of a backup, which sometimes can be very expensive and kind of messy.
So if you've got a clean pipe all the way through to the city connection, and you can see that the city connection's got some tree roots or maybe a partial collapse,
that's on them.
What do you recommend?
Well,
it's on the city.
That's on the city side, so that's on the city to take care of. But what people don't realize is that on their side, that's on the homeowner. So that can be expensive sometimes.
If there's a problem on their side.
Correct, but on the city, it's up to the city and their responsibility to take care of it from there.
All right. Rest of the HVAC system, and that is air conditioning.
Air conditioning, we can test in the summer. In the winter, it's very hard.
Sure.
So we try and stay away from that. We always say make sure we have a weather cover over top of our ACs. We test it to make sure that it's functioning. Go easy on cranking the AC in the summertime because that can easily cause condensation as well. This goes back to what you were asking about education. So we've been telling our clients to make sure we tin wrap at every single seam on the HVAC exposed in the furnace room. That's to basically keep the air flowing. And when you have holes in the HVAC, it's very much like drinking a milkshake with holes in a straw. It's not a very efficient way of drinking a milkshake, correct? Yeah?
Sure.
So this is why we advise our clients to HVAC caulk, fire caulk, and tin tape at every joint that we can possibly get it at. Now when you come into a warm home and you crank the AC, or when you get hot and cold together, that creates condensation. So sometimes those little holes in the HVAC will leak out water, which will cause a stain, and sometimes people will think that that's a plumbing issue. And that's why we have our thermal cameras. And that's why you have our expertise to determine where it's coming from and what it could potentially be.
Earlier you had mentioned that you use the thermal cameras when you're doing roof. Do you use the thermal cameras anywhere else in the home?
Everywhere. On the interior walls, on the exterior walls, on the ceilings, in the attic. We're looking for water. We're looking for slouching insulation. We're also looking at structural issues. So where maybe you're missing some midspan blocking, which isn't super important, but it's just good building practice. Or we're looking for tall wall blocking in stairwells. That's good building practice as well, especially in new construction. So it allows us to see the skeleton of the home, which is probably the most important thing.
Does it also show lack of insulation or drafty areas?
Absolutely it does. I can actually see cold and hot. I can see drafts and I can see wafting. Cold points, sometimes, there's cold points in everyone's home, okay? Sometimes a cold point isn't worth fixing. It's almost worth paying the 50 cents or $1 more per month in your heating and your utilities rather than fixing it. That's like cutting your pinky and cutting your arm off as a solution sometimes. So we leave it alone. But when you got a lot of missing insulation, that's why you have the thermal there.
All right.
Like in attics, we've seen that a lot lately.
What should the R value be in a home that a potential buyer is looking at?
That depends on the year. The City of Calgary changes the code every single year. So right now, I think we're sitting around 40, 45, and I think they're going to jump that up to close to 70, which is a lot. Don't quote me on that one, but I've heard it through the grapevine.
So that's going to mean that people who have a certain depth of insulation or a certain kind of insulation in their attics,
Correct.
will be looking at the added expense of topping up the depth of that insulation.
True, not a huge expense, but very vital. It's kind of like if you don't have a good toque on your head, or if you have a toque on your head and you cut a hole in the top, well, you're losing all the heat. It's a very important part of the house, and so is the attic hatch at that. But while we're talking about the attic, we also go into that attic to look for things like vermiculite, which contains asbestos.
Yes.
I just want to make sure everyone understands that asbestos is very bad for you, but it is your exposure. A lot of times if it's left alone, you're fine. And vermiculite is an insulator, so it's a good one too.
All right. So
But
as long
leave
as
it
you
alone.
don't disturb it,
Yeah.
it's the same with some early linoleum tiles
Correct.
carried asbestos backing, and so if you're ripping up tiles, you should know what the construction is.
Correct. There's urea, there's all sorts of things out there that are killing us. And 10 years from now, we'll find out that there's something else that we're doing right now that's killing us. But we just have to learn to live with certain things, obviously, even radon. I'm not the foremost expert on radon, but ventilation is key, absolute key. And the way that we're doing mitigation right now is good, but I know there's other countries that are doing it better, and we'll get there. But if you ever want radon, there are guys out there that do it. Same with asbestos specifically, they'll do asbestos and they'll also do mold testing. But when I get into a house, if I see something that looks like mold or asbestos or a product containing it, I'm gonna flag it and you're gonna know about it. And that's why you're hiring a home inspector.